We'd prefer if you left. Claire's words sliced through the glittering Christmas parlor. Her diamond necklace caught the chandelier's fire. Her eyes swept over me with contempt. My coat was still damp from sleet. My hands were streaked with grease from a roadside engine. The burgundy dress I'd ironed so carefully hung wrinkled and ruined. I had come 30 minutes late to my sons-in-law's mansion. I was hoping for grace. I found only the door of their disdain. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. 3 weeks earlier, the invitation arrived. Heavy cardstock, gold embossed lettering. The Whitmore family's annual Christmas party. December 22nd. Cocktails at 6. I held it under the kitchen light. My hands were steady. My heart was not. For 3 years I had been the invisible in-law. Tolerated on holidays. Ignored the rest of the time. This invitation felt like a final exam. One I could not afford to fail. The card smelled faintly of expensive paper. The kind that doesn't bend. The kind that knows its worth. I set it on the counter next to my coffee mug. The mug had a chip on the rim. Robert had bought it 20 years ago at a flea market. He'd been gone 4 years now. Some mornings I still reached for 2 cups. My son Ethan called that evening. His voice carried the careful tone he used when delivering bad news gently. He reminded me the Whitmores took these gatherings seriously. He suggested I keep things classy. He didn't say the rest. He didn't have to. I heard what lived beneath his words. Don't embarrass me. Don't embarrass yourself. Don't remind them you're not one of us. I told him I understood. I did. After we hung up, I stood in the hallway. The mirror showed a woman of 64. Gray hair that refused to hold a curl. Lines around the eyes that came from laughing and squinting and surviving. A body that had worked 40 years behind bookstore counters and grocery checkout lanes. Not the body that belonged in a Greenwich mansion. Not the face that matched their crystal and their oil paintings and their casual mentions of summer homes. But I was Ethan's mother. That still meant something. Or I wanted it to. I scheduled a salon appointment for the morning of the party. I pulled the burgundy dress from the back of my closet. It was secondhand. I'd found it at a church sale 2 years ago. The fabric was good. The seams were straight. It would do. I laid out the black heels that pinched my toes. I found the small pearl earrings Robert had given me on our 20th anniversary. Real pearls. He'd saved for months. The week passed in a series of small preparations. I practiced standing in the heels for 15 minutes at a time. I rehearsed polite responses to questions about my work. Former work. The bookstore had closed 3 years ago when the owner retired. I did not rehearse what to say about my current job. Stocking shelves at a discount grocery store was not cocktail party material. Ethan called again 2 days before the event. He asked if I needed directions to the estate. I told him I'd already looked it up. He paused. Then he asked if I had something appropriate to wear. The question landed like a stone in still water. Ripples of doubt spread through my chest. I told him I had a dress. I did not describe it. He said that was good. He said he'd see me there. He said Claire was looking forward to it. The last part was a lie. We both knew it. Claire Whitmore had made her feelings clear from the beginning. She came from old money. The kind that never raised its voice because it never had to. She'd met Ethan at a startup hackathon. He'd impressed her with his coding skills. She'd impressed him with her confidence. They'd been married 2 years now. I'd attended the wedding in a borrowed dress. I'd smiled in the photographs. I'd felt the weight of every glance from her family. The weight said I didn't belong. Claire never said it directly. She was too polished for that. But her mother Veronica had a gift for pointed questions. Questions about my education, my neighborhood, my late husband's profession, carpenter. I'd said it with my chin up. Robert had built things that lasted. Staircases that didn't creak. Bookshelves that held 3 generations of stories. Kitchen tables where families still gathered. Veronica had smiled. The smile said she'd heard enough. December 22nd arrived with sleet. The weather report called it an ice storm. Roads across Connecticut were glazing over. Power lines were down in 3 counties. My salon called at 8 in the morning. No power. Appointments cancelled. Sorry for the inconvenience. I stood in my kitchen. The burgundy dress hung on the back of a chair. The heels sat waiting by the door. My hair was still damp from the shower. No salon. No professional styling. No armor. The smart choice was to call Ethan. Tell him the weather made it impossible. Apologize. Stay home. I looked at the dress. I looked at the clock. I thought about 3 years of being invisible. I dried my hair as best I could. I put on the dress. I fastened the pearl earrings. I slid my feet into the pinching heels. The drive to Greenwich took twice as long as planned. Traffic crawled. Ice made the highway a skating rink. My old Honda handled it steadily. Robert had taught me to drive in snow. Gentle on the brakes. Eyes far ahead. Respect the conditions. I gripped the wheel. My knuckles were pale. My breath fogged the windshield. The heater worked but barely. The GPS announced I was 15 minutes from the Whitmore estate. Then 10. Then 5. The road narrowed. Trees hung heavy with ice. Driveways disappeared into private darkness behind stone walls and iron gates. Then I saw her. A woman standing beside a luxury sedan. Silver hair plastered to her head by sleet. The car's hood was up. Hazard lights blinked in the gray afternoon. Logic said to keep driving. I was already late. Stopping would make me later. The woman probably had roadside assistance on speed dial. But Robert's voice lived in my head. You stop. You help. That's what people do. I pulled over. Ice crunched under my tires. The woman turned. She was older than me. Late 70s perhaps. Her coat was expensive. Cashmere probably. Her posture was straight despite the cold. I rolled down my window. Asked if she needed help. She looked at me. Really looked. The way people do when they're measuring competence instead of status. She said the car wouldn't start. She'd tried twice. She didn't know why. I told her I'd take a look. I got out. Sleet hit my face like small cold needles. The burgundy dress soaked through immediately. I asked her to pop the hood again. She did. I leaned over the engine. My hands were already numb. I checked the battery terminals. They were crusted with white corrosion. Classic problem. Robert had shown me this fix 100 times. I asked if she had any cola in the car. Soda. Anything acidic. She stared at me. Then she opened her designer handbag. She pulled out a small glass bottle. Some expensive sparkling water brand. It would do. I poured it over the battery posts. The corrosion fizzed. I wiped the terminals with the hem of my dress. Black grit streaked the burgundy fabric. I told her to try the ignition. She got in. Turned the key. The engine caught. It held. She stepped back out. Her expression had shifted. Assessment had become respect. She offered me a business card. Heavy stock. Gold lettering. Lillian Whitmore. The name hit me like the sleet. Lillian Whitmore. The matriarch, Claire's grandmother. The woman whose house I was already late to. I looked down at my dress. Soaked, stained, ruined. My hands were black with grease. My hair hung in wet strings. Lillian Whitmore looked at me. Then she smiled. A real smile. The kind that reaches the eyes. She said she'd see me at the house. She got in her car. The sedan pulled away smoothly. I stood on the side of the road. Ice pelted my shoulders. The burgundy dress clung to my legs. My breath came out in white clouds. I got back in my Honda. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror. Mascara smudged. Lipstick faded. Dress destroyed. I could still turn around. Go home. Text Ethan an apology about the weather and bad luck. But something had shifted on that roadside. Something in the way Lillian Whitmore had looked at me after the engine started. Like I was a person. Not a problem. Not an embarrassment. A person who'd stopped to help. I pulled back onto the road. The GPS said I was 8 minutes away. I drove through the ice. Through the doubt. Through the voice that said I didn't belong. The Whitmore estate appeared through the trees like something from a different century. Stone and columns and terraced gardens under a coating of ice. Lights glowed in every window. Cars lined the circular driveway. Luxury makes I couldn't name. My Honda looked like a lost grocery cart. Valets stood under the portico. They wore matching coats. They looked at my car the way people look at accidents. With pity and confusion. I parked. I got out. My heels clicked on the ice. My ruined dress dripped onto pristine stone. The front door was already open. Warm light spilled out. Music played somewhere inside. Laughter floated over crystal and conversation. I stepped through the doorway. Into the bright impossible world of people who'd never stood on a roadside in the sleet. People who'd never had to choose between pride and decency. A chandelier hung overhead like a frozen waterfall. Every surface gleamed. Every face was smooth and smiling and completely unaware that I was about to ruin their perfect party. But I was here, soaked and stained and 30 minutes late. And somewhere in that golden crowd was the woman whose car I'd just fixed. The woman who'd looked at me like I mattered. I took a breath, lifted my chin, walked forward into the light. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. The foyer smelled of pine and cinnamon and money. A server passed with champagne flutes balanced on a silver tray. Crystal caught the light. Bubbles rose in perfect vertical lines. The glasses cost more than my monthly grocery budget. I declined with a small shake of my head. My hands were still dirty. Black grease lined my fingernails. I tucked them against my sides. Conversations hummed around me. Voices layered over piano music. Someone laughed. The sound was bright and effortless. The sound of people who'd never worried about being late, or unwelcome, or wrong. A woman in emerald silk glanced at me. Her eyes traveled from my wet hair to my stained dress to my scuffed heels. She looked away quickly, found something fascinating in her champagne. The crowd seemed to part without actually moving. A space opened around me. Not hostile, just careful. The way people step around puddles. Then I saw Ethan. He stood near the fireplace. His suit fit perfectly. His tie was the blue I'd given him last Christmas. Claire stood beside him. Her hand rested on his arm. Possessive. Decorative. Both. Her dress was midnight blue. Silk or satin or something that moved like water. Diamonds sparkled at her throat. Her hair was pulled back in a way that required professional hands. She saw me. Her expression froze, then cracked. Shock first. Then something harder. Ethan turned. His face went through 3 emotions in 2 seconds. Relief. Confusion. Worry. He started toward me. Claire's grip tightened on his arm. Stopped him mid-step. A man appeared at my elbow. Tall. Silver hair. Tailored suit that whispered wealth. His smile was practiced. Professional. Empty as a showroom. He introduced himself as Charles Whitmore, Claire's father. He shook my hand briefly. His palm was smooth. No calluses. No scars from 40 years of work. He said he was glad I could make it. His tone said otherwise. He mentioned the weather. Said these roads could be treacherous. Said perhaps I'd like to freshen up before joining the party. The words were polite. The meaning was clear. You don't belong here. Not like this. Maybe not at all. I opened my mouth to respond. To apologize. To retreat. Then a voice cut through the room. Sharp as January wind. Clear as a bell at closing time. Lillian Whitmore stood at the top of 3 marble steps. Her silver hair was dry now. Styled. Her dress was deep burgundy. Almost the color of mine. Almost. She announced that her arrival had been delayed. She thanked the guest who'd stopped to help. She gestured toward me. Every head turned. The room went quiet. Piano music continued, but conversation died. Even the champagne bubbles seemed to pause. Lillian descended the steps. Her heels clicked on marble. Each step was deliberate. Measured. She crossed the foyer directly to where I stood. Where Charles stood beside me wearing his empty smile. She said my name. Nora Bennett. She said it like it mattered. Like it belonged in this room as much as any other name. More than some. She asked Charles if he'd offered me a seat. A drink. Anything at all. Charles's smile tightened. He said he'd suggested I might want to freshen up. He gestured vaguely toward a powder room. Somewhere away from the guests. Somewhere I could be hidden. Lillian's expression didn't change, but the temperature dropped. I felt it. Charles felt it. The woman in emerald silk felt it from 15 feet away. Lillian said that Nora had been helping stranded motorists. That freshening up could wait. That sometimes arriving with a story was better than arriving on time. She turned to the room. Her voice carried without rising. She explained how her car had died on an icy road. How I'd stopped. How I'd fixed a corroded battery with sparkling water in the hem of my dress. Faces shifted. The careful distance became curiosity. A man with white hair and military posture stepped forward. Asked what the problem had been. Asked how I'd known what to do. I told him about the terminals. About the corrosion. About Robert teaching me basic repairs 30 years ago in our driveway. 1-cylinder engine. 2-cylinder. 4. Same principles. Different scale. The man nodded. He said he'd served in Korea. Said field mechanics saved more lives than medals. Said it was good to meet someone who understood tools. Another voice joined in. Then another. Questions about the storm. About the roads. About how long I'd been stranded helping. Not long, I said. Maybe 10 minutes. Anyone would have done it. But anyone hadn't. Lillian's voice was quiet. But it landed. Everyone had passed that sedan. Everyone had seen the hazard lights. Everyone had chosen the party over the person. Except me. The silence that followed was different. Not exclusion. Evaluation. I felt the room recalculating. Adjusting. Making space that hadn't existed 3 minutes ago. Claire moved through the crowd. Her smile was fixed. Bright. Brittle as spun sugar. She said she was so glad I'd made it safely. She said we'd been worried. She touched my arm. Her fingers were cold despite the room's warmth. She suggested we find me something dry to wear. She had clothes upstairs. We were about the same size. Weren't we? We weren't. But the offer wasn't about kindness. It was about control. About covering up the evidence. About restoring the picture she wanted the room to see. I thanked her. I declined. I said the dress would dry. I'd survived worse than sleet. Claire's smile didn't waver. But her eyes did. Just for a moment. Just long enough to show the anger underneath. A server appeared with a tray. This time I took a glass. Water, not champagne. My hands left faint marks on the crystal. I didn't apologize. Lillian guided me toward the drawing room. Her hand barely touched my elbow. But the gesture was clear. You're with me. You're under my protection. You belong. The crowd followed. Not all at once. But gradually. The way water fills a space. Conversations resumed. But they were different now. Eyes kept drifting back. Reassessing the woman in the ruined dress. Ethan caught up to me near the doorway. His face was complicated. Embarrassed and proud and confused all at once. He asked if I was okay. He asked what had happened. I told him about the battery. About Lillian's car. About the choice between being late and being decent. He looked at me. Really looked. The way he used to when he was small and I was the one who had all the answers. Before he'd learned that some questions don't have good answers. Before he'd married into a world that asked different questions entirely. He said he was glad I'd stopped. He said it was very me. He didn't say whether that was good or bad. Claire appeared at his side. She looped her arm through his. Smiled at me. Said dinner would be served soon. Said I should take my time. Get comfortable. Make myself at home. The last part was a lie. We both knew it. This would never be my home. Not in the way she meant. Not with these carpets and these chandeliers and these people who'd never fixed anything with their own hands. But maybe that was fine. Maybe home wasn't about belonging. Maybe it was about knowing who you were. Even when you were soaked. Even when you were stained. Even when you were standing in a mansion that smelled like pine and cinnamon and money. Lillian was watching from across the room. Her expression was thoughtful, measuring, like she was seeing something she hadn't expected. Something that might be useful. Or dangerous. Or both. I lifted my water glass. Took a sip. The crystal was cold against my lips. The water tasted clean. Neutral. Like Switzerland or a held breath. The piano shifted to something classical. Mozart maybe. Something light and complicated and designed to fill space without demanding attention. I stood in the Whitmore drawing room. In my ruined dress and my pinching heels. With grease under my nails and sleet in my hair. And for the first time in 3 years, I didn't feel invisible. The room had seen me. Really seen me. Not as Ethan's mother. Not as the woman who didn't belong. But as someone who'd stopped on an icy road. Someone who'd chosen help over image. Someone who knew how to fix things. Dinner was announced. The crowd moved toward the dining room. Voices rose and fell. Silverware clinked. Somewhere a cork popped. I followed. One step at a time. My heels clicked on marble. Then hardwood. Then oriental carpet thick enough to swallow sound. The dining table stretched like a landing strip. White cloth. Gold chargers. Flowers that must have cost more than my car. Place cards in calligraphy. Each name in its proper position. I found mine. Near the middle. Not at the end. Not in the corner. Close enough to matter. Lillian sat at the head. Charles at the foot. Claire and Ethan across from me. The white-haired veteran 3 seats down. I sat. The chair was solid, carved wood, the kind that outlasted families. The cushion was firm, brocade or damask or something equally impractical. Servers appeared with the first course. Soup in shallow bowls, garnish arranged like art, the kind of food that required multiple utensils and uncertain strategy. I watched Lillian, used the spoon she used, started where she started, followed the unspoken rules. The soup tasted like butternut squash. Or pumpkin. Something autumn pretending to be elegant. It was good, not worth the presentation, but good. Conversation flowed around the table. The weather, the markets, someone's daughter at Yale, someone's son in London. Words that meant nothing, words that meant everything. Passwords to a club I'd never joined. But I was here, at the table, in the room, present in a way I hadn't been before. Lillian caught my eye, raised her glass slightly. The gesture was small, private, an acknowledgement between people who understood what it meant to be underestimated. I raised my water glass in return. The crystal caught the light. Bubbles I didn't have rose in lines I couldn't follow. But I was here, and the night was just beginning. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. The main course arrived on white porcelain. Beef tenderloin. Roasted vegetables arranged like geometry. Sauce pooled in a careful crescent. The plate was a painting. The food was an afterthought. I used the correct fork. Lillian had taught me without speaking. Left to right, outside in. Rules that made no sense but mattered anyway. Charles cleared his throat. The sound drew attention. He began talking about the company. Whitmore and Hale Holdings. Fourth quarter projections. Market share. Revenue streams. His voice was smooth, confident. The voice of a man accustomed to being heard. Being believed. Being obeyed. He mentioned employee efficiency improvements. Streamlined operations. Reduced overhead. The words sounded clean. Clinical. Like a surgical procedure. Not like people losing jobs before Christmas. Lillian's knife paused against her plate. The sound was small, but it carried. Charles faltered mid-sentence. Caught himself. Continued. He talked about shareholder value. Competitive positioning. Strategic realignment. Words that meant nothing. Words that meant everything. Words that erased faces and families and 40 years of showing up. I cut my beef. The knife was heavy. Silver. Old. The kind that lasted generations. The kind you didn't throw away when something shinier appeared. The white-haired veteran asked about employee retention. He used that exact phrase. Not turnover. Retention. Like he knew the difference mattered. Charles smiled. He said retention was acceptable. Within industry standards. Nothing to worry about. Lillian set down her fork. The gesture was quiet, deliberate, final. She said that acceptable was a word people used when they'd stopped caring. She said Robert McNamara had called Vietnam casualties acceptable. She said the Titanic's lifeboat shortage had been acceptable. She said acceptable was another word for failed. The table went silent. Even the servers paused. Even the candles seemed to still their flames. Charles laughed. The sound was uncomfortable. He said mother was being dramatic. He said business required difficult choices. He said she of all people should understand. Lillian asked what she should understand. Her voice was level, but something moved underneath it. Something old and patient and done with waiting. Charles said she'd built the company. She knew how markets worked. She knew sentiment couldn't drive decisions. Numbers had to lead. Lillian dabbed her mouth with her napkin. The linen was starched, monogrammed. She folded it precisely, placed it beside her plate. She said numbers were important. She agreed. She said she'd built the company on numbers. Real numbers, not the decorative kind. Charles started to respond. Lillian continued. She said employee satisfaction was down 18% since he'd taken over. She cited the survey. The one from September. The one Charles had mentioned briefly then buried in appendices. She said community investment had dropped from 4% to 1.2%. She named the programs cut. The Literacy Initiative. The Scholarship Fund. The Employee Childcare Subsidy. She said volunteer hours had fallen from 12,000 to 800. Company-wide. Year over year. She had the memo. The one that called volunteerism a scheduling inefficiency. Charles's smile was thin now. Brittle. He said those decisions had been strategic. Board approved. Fiscally responsible. Lillian asked who sat on the board. She knew the answer. She'd appointed half of them. But she asked anyway. She said boards followed leadership. She said leadership set culture. She said culture determined whether a company had a soul or just a balance sheet. The veteran nodded. Small. Almost invisible. But I saw it. Claire touched Charles's arm. A warning. A plea. Charles shook her off gently. His jaw was tight. His neck was red above his collar. He said the company was thriving. Stock price proved it. Revenue proved it. They'd never been stronger. Lillian asked stronger for whom? She let the question hang. Let it settle over the tenderloin and the geometric vegetables and the sauce that had gone cold. She turned to me, asked what I thought made a company strong. The table turned. Every eye, every paused fork, every held breath. I hadn't expected to speak. Hadn't prepared a speech. Hadn't rehearsed corporate language. But Lillian's eyes held mine. Steady, waiting, trusting. I said I'd worked 40 years behind counters. I said I'd seen businesses live and die. I said the strong ones knew their people's names. Knew their children's names. Showed up when pipes burst. When parents died. When life hit hard. I said numbers told you what. People told you why. I said why mattered more than most spreadsheets admitted. The veteran nodded again. Larger this time. Visible. A woman in pearls 3 seats down was listening. Really listening. Not just being polite. I said Robert had built furniture. Custom pieces. He could have used cheaper wood. Faster joints. Less time. More profit. But he didn't. Because the families who bought his tables wanted something their grandchildren would use. Something that lasted beyond quarterly reports. I said lasting wasn't the same as profitable. But sometimes it was better. Sometimes it was the point. Lillian's expression didn't change. But something behind her eyes did. Recognition maybe. Or confirmation. Like I'd answered a question she'd been asking for years. Charles set down his fork. The sound was sharp. He said that was lovely sentiment. He used that word, sentiment, like it was a weakness. Like it was quaint. He said the modern marketplace didn't reward nostalgia. He said competition was brutal. Margins were razor thin. Sentiment was a luxury they couldn't afford. Lillian asked when compassion had become a luxury. She asked when dignity had required a business case. She asked when he'd forgotten what the company was built on. Charles said the company was built on her vision. Her drive. Her willingness to make hard choices. He was honoring that legacy. He was protecting her life's work. Lillian said he was protecting his bonus structure. She said it quietly, but the words cut clean. Surgical. Precise. Silence spread like spilled wine. Claire's face was pale. Ethan stared at his plate. The woman in pearls looked fascinated. Horrified. Both. A server appeared. Cleared plates. Disappeared. The sound of porcelain on porcelain filled the void. Movement instead of words. Lillian stood. The table stood with her. Automatic. Trained. She said coffee would be served in the library. She said some of them should join her. She looked at me, at the veteran, at 3 others whose names I didn't know. Charles stayed seated, just for a moment, just long enough to show resistance. Then he stood. His smile was back, professional, empty, the mask that nothing touched. Claire leaned toward Ethan, whispered something urgent. He nodded, looked at me. His eyes held apology, confusion, something that might have been pride if he'd allowed it. The library was darker than the dining room. Wood panels, leather chairs, books that climbed to the ceiling. A fire burned behind a brass screen. The smell was smoke and old paper and decisions made decades ago. Lillian sat near the hearth. Not at a desk, not in the biggest chair. Just near the warmth. Like a person, not a portrait. She gestured to the chair beside her. I sat. The leather was soft, worn, shaped by bodies that had come before. Bodies that had sat here and decided things. Important things. Things that rippled forward into now. Charles stood by the window. His posture was controlled, but his hands were fists. White-knuckled, barely visible in the dim light. Lillian began to speak. Her voice was different now. Not the formal dinner voice. Not the public voice. The real one. The one that had argued with bankers. With lawyers. With men who'd said no because she was a woman. With the world that had tried to make her small. She said she'd founded Whitmore and Hale in 1970. She said founded, not co-founded, not helped start, founded. She said she'd rented a storefront in Bridgeport with money saved from 3 jobs. She said banks had laughed at her, called her sweetie, suggested she try something more suitable, like secretarial work, like teaching, like anything that kept her small and grateful and quiet. She said she'd gotten the loan from a credit union. Union workers who understood what it meant to be underestimated. Who bet on her because they recognized hunger. The good kind. The kind that built things. She said her husband had been the public face. The speeches. The handshakes. The photographs. Because 1970 wasn't ready for women who led. Who decided. Who refused to smile when men patted their hands. She said she'd let them think it was his company. His vision. His success. Because getting the work done mattered more than getting the credit. Because the buildings got built either way. The employees got paid either way. The community got lifted either way. But now she was old. And old women were granted certain freedoms. The freedom to stop pretending. The freedom to correct the record. The freedom to say his name was on the company. But her spine was in it. Charles started to speak. Lillian raised one hand. The gesture was small, but absolute. He closed his mouth. She said the company had been built on 3 principles. Pay fairly. Treat people like humans. Leave the community better than you found it. She said those weren't sentiment. They were structure. The foundation that held everything else. She said Charles had forgotten. Or never learned. Or decided quarterly earnings mattered more than quarterly visits to employees in the hospital. More than Christmas bonuses that let single mothers fix their cars. More than knowing the names. She said knowing the names was everything. The rest was just accounting. The fire popped. Sparks rose. Died. The library held its breath. Lillian looked at me, then at Charles, then back at the flames. She said she'd been watching. For 3 years. Watching the drift. The slow steady erosion of everything she'd built. Everything she'd meant. She said tonight had clarified things. Watching me stop on an icy road. Watching me fix what was broken. Watching me choose decency over convenience. Over image. Over arrival time. She said I'd reminded her what the company used to be. Used to mean. Used to build. And now she was going to remind everyone else. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Coffee arrived in silver pots. China cups. No handles. Just small cylinders of white porcelain that burned fingertips. I held mine carefully. Let the steam rise between us. Lillian reached into a leather portfolio beside her chair. She withdrew a single sheet of paper. Cream-colored. Heavy stock. The kind lawyers used for documents that mattered. She said she'd prepared something. A proposal. She'd discussed it with Daniel Price, the family attorney, a man who'd known the company since its first lease signing. Daniel sat 3 chairs away. Gray suit. Quiet presence. He nodded once. Confirmation without commentary. Lillian said the company needed recalibration. She used that word. Not rescue. Not intervention. Recalibration. Like adjusting an instrument that had drifted out of tune. She said Charles would remain CEO. The statement landed softly. But it mattered. Charles's shoulders dropped half an inch. Relief. Or surprise. Or both. But board oversight would increase. Monthly reviews instead of quarterly. Community investment would return to 4%. Employee satisfaction surveys would be mandatory. Transparent. Publicly posted. Charles started to object. His mouth opened. Lillian continued without pause. She said volunteer hours would be tracked. Celebrated. Tied to management bonuses. She said the childcare subsidy would be reinstated. The scholarship fund restored. The literacy program restarted by March. She said these weren't suggestions. They were conditions. Board-approved conditions. Daniel had the votes. She'd made the calls. Done the math. Built the majority. The fire crackled. Sparks climbed the chimney. The library absorbed the words like it had absorbed 50 years of decisions before this one. Charles said this was extreme. He said the board had trusted his leadership. Had supported his vision. This felt like a coup. Lillian said it was a correction. She said coups happened fast. This had been slow. 3 years of watching. Of data collection. Of quiet conversations with board members who remembered what the company used to mean. She said she'd given him time. Chances. Opportunities to remember. To recalibrate himself. But the metrics kept sliding. The culture kept thinning. The soul kept leaking out. Claire stood abruptly. Her chair scraped against hardwood. She said this was humiliating. She said her father had built the company's current success. Had doubled revenues. Had positioned them for acquisition offers. Lillian asked if Claire knew the turnover rate in manufacturing. Claire paused. Didn't answer. Lillian said it was 32%. Industry average was 18%. She said exit interviews mentioned pressure. Impossible quotas. Managers who'd forgotten workers were people. Were parents. Were exhausted. She said acquisition offers weren't success. They were just other companies buying your customer list. Your market share. Not your values. Not your people. just the profitable parts. The woman in pearls from dinner appeared in the doorway. She asked if she should leave. Lillian said no, said this concerned everyone. Everyone who cared about what companies owed their communities. The woman entered, sat near the veteran. Others followed. The library filled quietly. Witnesses, stakeholders, people who'd decided this mattered more than dessert. Ethan stood near the back. His face was complicated, torn. He was watching his wife, his mother, his grandmother-in-law, 3 generations of expectations colliding in leather and firelight. Lillian returned to the document. She said there was one more piece. A new position. Head of Community Partnerships and Values Integration. Reporting directly to her. 6-month trial. Renewable based on measurable impact. She said the role required someone who understood work. Real work. Not strategy sessions. Not consultant presentations. Someone who'd fixed things with their hands. Known struggle. Chosen people over polish. The room was silent. Coffee cooled in handleless cups. The fire was the only sound. Breathing. Burning. Waiting. Lillian looked at me. Her eyes were clear. Direct. No apology. No hesitation. She said she was offering me the position. Starting January 2nd. Salary that would end rent worries. Benefits. Office. Resources to rebuild what had been cut. The words hit like the sleet had hit hours ago. Cold. Sharp. Impossible to ignore. I felt every eye turn. Every calculation start. Every doubt bloom in the warm library air. Claire said this was insane. She said I had no business background. No corporate experience. No credentials that justified a senior position. Lillian said credentials were one kind of knowing. Life was another. She said I'd stopped on an icy road. Fixed a stranger's car. Arrived ruined and unapologetic. That showed character. Judgment. The kind you couldn't teach in business school. She said the teachable parts would be taught. Daniel would advise. HR would train. She herself would mentor. But character came ready-made or not at all. Charles said the board would never approve this. Would see it as nepotism. As sentiment overriding sense. Lillian said the board had already been consulted. Daniel had drafted the resolution. 5 members had committed. 2 more were probable. The vote would happen Tuesday. After the holiday. Before the new year. She said Charles could support it or oppose it. Either way the position existed. Either way someone would fill it. She preferred that someone be me. The portfolio returned to its place beside her chair. The document disappeared, but its weight remained, hanging in the air like smoke. Like possibility. Like a door opening onto a hallway I'd never imagined. I set down my coffee cup. The porcelain clicked against the side table. Small sound. Definite. Final. I said I needed to understand what was being asked. Not the title. Not the salary. The actual work. The daily reality. The expectations beyond the words. Lillian said the work was rebuilding relationships. With employees. With community organizations. With the people who'd been treated like line items instead of lives. She said I'd visit facilities. Talk to workers. Listen to complaints. Identify what was broken. What needed fixing. What needed protecting. Then I'd report back. Recommend changes. Push for implementation. She said some people would resent me. Would see me as Lillian's spy. Charles's leash. An outsider with unearned authority. That resistance was guaranteed. I asked what authority I'd actually have. What power beyond recommendation. Beyond reporting. Lillian said I'd have her backing. The board's backing. access to budgets previously restricted, the ability to restore programs, restart initiatives, overrule middle management when values were at stake. She said it wasn't symbolic. It was structural. Real power with real accountability. Real impact with real consequences if I failed. The fire shifted. Logs settled. Heat pulsed into the room in waves. My dress was finally dry. The grease stains had set. Permanent now. Marked. I thought about Robert. About 40 years of showing up. About bookshelves that held 3 generations. About the difference between doing a job and doing it right. I thought about the grocery store. About scanning items at minimum wage. About going home to an empty apartment. About the slow invisible slide toward irrelevance. I thought about Ethan. About the worry in his eyes. The pride he couldn't quite show. The choice between his mother and his marriage. Between 2 worlds that didn't speak the same language. I thought about the sleet. About the roadside. About choosing to stop when everyone else had driven past. The library waited. The fire waited. Lillian waited with the patience of someone who'd built companies and raised families and learned that good answers took time. I said I'd never worked in an office. Never written a corporate report. Never navigated politics beyond neighborhood associations and PTA meetings. Lillian said those were features, not flaws. She said corporate language was learnable. Political navigation was teachable. But genuine care for people wasn't. Either you had it or spent your career faking it. She said I'd stopped for her car. That single choice revealed more than any resume. Any credential. Any interview performance. I asked what happened if I failed. If the 6 months proved I was wrong for this. Wrong for corporate structures. Wrong for rooms like these. Lillian said failure was possible. Maybe probable. But trying mattered more than succeeding. She said the company had succeeded its way into hollowness. Maybe failure in the right direction was better than success in the wrong one. Claire made a sound. Disgust or disbelief. She said this was a mistake. A sentimental gesture that would damage the company. Embarrass the family. Prove Lillian had lost her edge. Lillian said her edge had never been about cutting people. It had been about building things that lasted. Things that mattered. Things that made workers proud. Made communities stronger. Made profit feel like partnership instead of extraction. She said if that was losing her edge, then she'd lost it 50 years ago. And would happily lose it again. The room held its breath. Coffee grew cold. The fire burned down to embers. Glowing. Patient. Warm enough to last. I looked at my hands. At the grease still visible under my nails. At the calluses from years of lifting. Stacking. Surviving. I looked at Lillian. At the woman who'd built something real. Who'd let history erase her name. Who'd decided finally that silence cost too much. I looked at the library. At the books climbing to darkness. At the chairs shaped by bodies making decisions. At the fireplace that had witnessed 50 years of choices. Some good, some terrible, all permanent. I said yes. The word was small, but it filled the room. Filled the silence. Filled the space between who I'd been and who I might become. Lillian smiled. Not the public smile. The real one. Relief and recognition and something like hope. She said we'd start after New Year's. She said Daniel would handle paperwork. HR would schedule orientation. She herself would meet with me weekly. Guide the transition. Answer questions. Provide cover when resistance came. Because resistance would come. From Charles. From management. From people who'd built careers on the very culture I was being hired to dismantle. But that was future trouble. Tonight was just agreement, just a yes in a library. Just a woman in a ruined dress accepting an impossible offer. Just the beginning of everything changing. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. The library emptied slowly. Guests drifted toward the foyer. Toward coats and valets and the sleet that had finally stopped. Conversations resumed in lower registers. Careful tones. The kind people used when witnessing something they'd discuss later. Privately. Endlessly. The woman in pearls paused near my chair. She said what I'd done on the roadside was admirable. What Lillian had offered was extraordinary. She wished me luck. Her voice carried sincerity and doubt, both in equal measure. The veteran shook my hand. His grip was firm. He said competence mattered more than credentials. He'd learned that in Korea. In business. In 60 years of watching people succeed and fail. He said I'd do fine. I wanted to believe him. Wanted to feel the confidence his words offered. But my stomach was tight. My hands were cold despite the fire's warmth. Claire stood near the doorway. Her back was rigid. Her jaw set. She caught Ethan's arm as he tried to approach me. Pulled him aside. Spoke in urgent whispers that carried shape but not content. Charles had disappeared. Slipped out during the acceptance. During the moment when yes had filled the room and rearranged everything. Lillian remained by the fire. She'd refilled her coffee. Sat with the portfolio open on her lap. Reading something. Making notes in careful script. Like nothing extraordinary had happened. Like she offered impossible jobs to unqualified strangers every Christmas. The room grew quiet. Just us now. Just the fire and the books and the weight of what I'd agreed to. Lillian looked up. Asked if I was having second thoughts. Her tone held no judgment. Just curiosity. Just the practical assessment of someone who'd built businesses by reading people accurately. I said I was having fifth and sixth thoughts. Maybe seventh. I said I didn't know what I was doing. Didn't know corporate structures. Didn't speak the language. Didn't own clothes appropriate for offices. Lillian said those were logistics. Solvable problems. She asked if I believed the work mattered. If community partnerships mattered. If treating employees like humans mattered. I said of course. Said I'd believed that for 40 years. Behind bookstore counters. At PTA meetings. In neighborhood associations that fought for playground funding. For crossing guards. For things that made ordinary lives slightly less hard. Lillian said then I had the only qualification that couldn't be taught. The rest was just learning. Just showing up. Just refusing to quit when corporate politics got ugly. And they would get ugly. She said it plainly. No sugarcoating. Charles would undermine me. Middle management would resist. People would wait for me to fail. Would bet on it. Would actively work toward it. I asked why she thought I could survive that. Why she believed a 64-year-old former bookstore clerk could navigate corporate warfare. Lillian said because I'd survived 64 years. Raised a son. Buried a husband. Worked 40 years in jobs that paid too little. That offered no security. That society dismissed as unskilled. She said survival was a skill. The most important one. She said I'd already proven I could endure. Could adapt. Could fix what was broken with whatever tools were available. She said cola and battery terminals weren't different from corporate problems. Both required diagnosis. Both required practical solutions. Both required willingness to get your hands dirty. The comparison felt absurd, but also somehow true. Both required seeing what was actually wrong. Not what people said was wrong. What actually needed fixing. Lillian closed her portfolio, set it aside. She said she'd founded the company at 42. Later than most. After her children were in school. After years of being told to wait. To let her husband lead. To be patient. She said patience had cost her. Had cost the company. Had let mediocre men make decisions that brilliant women would have made better. Faster. With more attention to human cost. She said she was 78 now. Running out of patience. Running out of time. She'd let Charles try his way. Let him prove that efficiency and profit could coexist with dignity. He'd failed. Or chosen not to try. The distinction didn't matter anymore. She said I represented a different approach. Not corporate. Not polished. Not trained in the language that obscured cruelty with terms like restructuring. Downsizing. Right-sizing. Optimization. She said I spoke plainly. Fixed things plainly. Cared plainly. That plain approach was exactly what the company needed. What employees needed. What she should have insisted on years ago. I asked about Ethan. About Claire. About the family tension this would create. The holidays that would never be the same. The damage to relationships that were already fragile. Lillian said families survived worse than disagreements. She said her own children had fought. Had taken sides. Had stopped speaking for years over business decisions. Over inheritance disputes. Over the fundamental question of what the company should be. She said eventually people chose. Chose money or meaning. Chose comfort or conviction. She said those choices revealed character. Sometimes beautifully. Sometimes brutally. She said Ethan would choose. Claire would choose. I couldn't control their choices. Could only control my own. Could only decide whether to accept opportunity or retreat to safety. To risk failure or guarantee stagnation. The fire had burned to coals. Red. Pulsing. The heat had dropped but the warmth remained. Steady. Reliable. Enough. Lillian stood. Smoothed her dress. She said we'd meet next week. December 29th. At her home. Not the office. Not yet. First we'd discuss strategy. History. The players I needed to understand. The battles I needed to anticipate. She said Daniel would send contracts. Benefits paperwork. Tax forms. The boring machinery of employment. She said HR would schedule orientation. January 2nd. 8 o'clock. Standard corporate indoctrination about policies and procedures and parking assignments. She said to ignore most of it. The real work would happen in factories. In break rooms. In conversations with third shift workers who'd been invisible for years. That's where I'd learn the actual state of things. That's where change would start or die. I stood. My legs were stiff. My feet ached in the pinching heels. The burgundy dress hung on me like history. Like evidence. Like a flag I'd planted without meaning to. Lillian walked me to the foyer. The mansion was nearly empty now. Just staff cleaning. Collecting glasses. Erasing evidence of the party. Of the night. Of the moment everything had shifted. My coat appeared. The valet had dried it. Brushed off the sleet. Hung it carefully despite its obvious age. Despite its discount store origins. I put it on. The fabric was still damp at the shoulders. Still cold. But familiar. Mine. Real in a way the library and the china and the impossible job offer weren't quite real yet. Lillian said she'd see me Thursday. She said to rest until then. To let the shock settle. To make peace with having said yes. With having stepped into a current I couldn't fully see. Couldn't fully control. Could only navigate. She said navigation was enough. More than enough. She'd built a company on navigation. On adjusting course. On responding to conditions. On refusing to pretend calm water was the only legitimate path. The front door opened. Cold air rushed in. Clean. Sharp. The sleet had stopped. The sky had cleared. Stars showed through breaks in the clouds. Distant. Steady. Indifferent to human drama. My Honda sat alone in the circular drive. The luxury cars had all departed. Just mine now. Economy model. 12 years old. Reliable in the way cheap things sometimes were. Built to last by accident rather than design. I walked down the stone steps. My heels clicked. Then stopped clicking. Reached the car. Opened the door. The interior smelled like old coffee. Like the vanilla air freshener that had lost its scent months ago. Like 40 years of practical choices. I sat. Closed the door. The mansion glowed behind me. Every window lit. Every room warm. Every surface reflecting wealth that had been earned and inherited and protected and now perhaps redirected. The engine started on the first try. Robert's maintenance still holding. Still doing its job years after his hands had gone still. I pulled out of the driveway. Onto the road. Past the spot where I'd stopped. Where Lillian's sedan had sat dead. Where cola and corrosion and common sense had changed everything. The drive home took 30 minutes. The roads were clear now. Ice melted or swept aside. Traffic lights blinked yellow through empty intersections. The world was asleep. Resting. Preparing for whatever came next. My apartment building appeared. Brick. 4 stories. Built in the 70s. Held together by rent control and stubborn landlords. Home for 12 years. Since Robert died. Since the house became too big. Too full of absence. I parked in my assigned spot. Number 17. Faded paint. Cracked asphalt. The Honda fit perfectly. Like it belonged. Like it knew its place. Inside, the apartment was cold. Heat clicked on automatically. Radiators hissed. The sound was familiar. Comforting. The sound of shelter. Of having somewhere to come back to. I hung the coat in the closet. Kicked off the heels. They landed with small thuds. Tomorrow I'd put them back in their box. Back in the closet. Maybe I'd need them again. Maybe not. The burgundy dress came off carefully. I folded it. The grease stains were permanent. The fabric would never recover. But that felt right somehow. Felt like documentation. Like proof this had happened. This impossible night. This ridiculous offer. This choice I'd made that would change everything or ruin everything or both. I made tea. Cheap bags. Grocery store brand. The water boiled. The steam rose. The cup warmed my hands. My clean hands. I'd scrubbed them. Scrubbed the grease away. But the memory remained. The feeling of battery terminals. Of corrosion fizzing. Of fixing what was broken because someone needed it fixed. I sat at the kitchen table. Robert's table. The one he'd built 40 years ago. Maple. Solid. 4 chairs though I only needed one now. The tea cooled. The radiators ticked. The building settled around me. Other lives in other apartments. Other people sleeping. Dreaming. Unaware that someone on the 3rd floor had just agreed to something impossible. I thought about January 2nd. About 8 o'clock. About walking into an office. Into a world I didn't understand. Into a role I wasn't qualified for. I thought about employees I'd never met. Communities I'd never seen. Problems I couldn't yet name. Resistance I could already feel gathering like weather. Like the ice storm that had somehow delivered me here. I thought about Lillian. About 78 years of building. Of watching. Of finally deciding that silence cost too much. That correction required risk. That sometimes you handed your life's work to a stranger with grease-stained hands and hoped for the best. The tea was cold now. But I drank it anyway. All of it, down to the bitter leaves at the bottom. Tomorrow would come. Then Thursday. Then January 2nd. Then the work. The real work. The kind that couldn't be rehearsed or studied. Could only be done. Or attempted. Or survived. But tonight was just this. Just me. Just an apartment. Just the quiet aftermath of having said yes. Just the moment before everything changed. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Thursday arrived cold and bright. December 29th. 3 days after the party. 4 days before my life became unrecognizable. I dressed carefully. Slacks from Target. Sweater from the clearance rack. Clean but not impressive. Honest in the way working wardrobes were. Lillian's address led to a different property. Not the mansion. A smaller house. Still expensive. Still Greenwich. But lived in. Human scaled. The kind of place where people actually sat on the furniture. The driveway was shorter. The door was wood. Heavy. Old. It opened before I could knock. Lillian wore slacks too. Cashmere probably. But slacks. A cream blouse. Reading glasses on a chain. She looked like someone's elegant grandmother. Not a corporate founder. Not a woman who'd spent 50 years building empires. She said welcome. Said come in. Said coffee was ready. Her voice was warmer here. Less formal. Like the house had permission to be real that the mansion never did. The living room held books. Everywhere. Floor to ceiling. Stacked on tables. Piled near chairs. The smell was paper and dust and decades of reading. The smell of my old bookstore. The smell of home. I must have smiled. Lillian noticed. She said books were her weakness. Her husband had collected art. She'd collected words. Stories. Ideas that lasted past quarterly reports. She gestured to a chair. Leather. Worn. Shaped by years of sitting. I sat. The cushion welcomed me. Familiar. Comfortable. Nothing like the rigid formality of Christmas night. Coffee appeared. Real mugs. Thick ceramic. Chipped at the rims. The kind you bought at hardware stores. The kind that lasted because no one cared enough to replace them. Lillian sat across from me. A folder rested on the table between us. Thick. Organized. The work of someone who'd spent a lifetime preparing. Planning. Building cases that couldn't be dismissed. She said we had 4 days. 4 days to prepare me for what was coming. For who was coming. For the resistance that would start the moment I walked through company doors. She opened the folder. Inside were photographs. Organizational charts. Printed emails. Handwritten notes. The accumulated evidence of 3 years watching a culture erode. She pointed to the first photo. Charles. Professional headshot. Confident smile. The face he showed to boards. To investors. To anyone who mattered in his carefully constructed world. She said Charles was smart. Educated. Credentialed in all the ways that impressed people who valued credentials. MBA from Wharton. 10 years at a consulting firm. Success measured in revenue growth. In stock appreciation. In numbers that looked good on paper. She said he'd forgotten people weren't paper. Weren't line items. Weren't resources to be optimized. He'd forgotten or never learned. The distinction didn't matter. The result was the same. She showed me the next photo. A woman, 50-something, sharp suit, sharper expression. Amanda Reeves, VP of Operations. Charles's right hand, his enforcer, his translator of vision into policy. Lillian said Amanda was brilliant, efficient, ruthless in the way corporations rewarded. She'd cut costs, streamlined processes, eliminated redundancies, corporate speak for firing people, for making remaining workers do 3 jobs for 1 salary. She said Amanda would see me as a threat, as Lillian's spy, as dead weight positioned above her in the organizational chart. She'd smile, she'd cooperate, she'd undermine every initiative with bureaucratic delays, with budget concerns, with feasibility studies that concluded nothing was feasible. The next photo showed a man. Younger, 30s maybe, expensive suit, tech company casual underneath. Marcus Webb, Director of Human Resources, the person who should have been protecting employees, who instead protected management from employees. Lillian said Marcus spoke fluent Our. He knew employment law, knew how to document, how to create paper trails that justified decisions already made, how to make firing someone look like organizational necessity rather than human failure. She said Marcus would be polite, would offer orientation, would explain policies designed to limit my authority, to channel complaints into processes that went nowhere, to protect the status quo while appearing to facilitate change. More photos, more names, more faces of people who'd built careers on the culture I was being hired to dismantle. Middle managers, department heads, people who'd learned to succeed by not caring, by measuring performance in metrics that ignored suffering. Lillian flipped to a different section. Employee surveys from 3 years ago, before Charles took over. Satisfaction scores in the 70s. Comments about fair treatment, about feeling valued, about pride in the work, in the company, in what they built together. Then surveys from 6 months ago. Satisfaction in the 40s. Comments about pressure, about impossible quotas, about managers who didn't listen, who didn't care, who treated people like machines that should run faster, break less, complain never. She showed me turnover data. Manufacturing up 32%. Warehouse up 28%. Customer service up 41%. Numbers that represented families, mortgages, health insurance lost, lives disrupted because caring had become expensive. She showed me community investment charts. The downward slope was steep, dramatic, from 4% to 1.2%. Programs cut, partnerships abandoned. Organizations that had relied on Whitmore support suddenly scrambling for funding, for survival. She said this was what I was walking into. This landscape of damage, of systematic erosion, of choices made in boardrooms that echoed in break rooms, in living rooms, in emergency rooms when stress became medical conditions. She said my job was documentation, was listening, was building a case for change that couldn't be dismissed as sentiment, as nostalgia, as one old woman's outdated values. She said I'd need numbers, data, evidence that dignity wasn't just moral. It was practical. That turnover cost money. That unhappy workers made mistakes. That community investment built loyalty. That short-term profit gains created long-term organizational damage. She said I'd need stories too. Real stories. Names and faces and specific examples of how policy became pain, how efficiency became cruelty, how optimization became erasure. She said I'd need to be careful. Professional. Unimpeachable. Because they'd be watching. Waiting for mistakes. For emotional outbursts. For proof that I was exactly what they suspected. An unqualified amateur. A sentimental old woman. Lillian's expensive mistake. The coffee had gone cold. The morning had become afternoon. Light shifted through windows. Changed angles. Painted the books in gold. In amber. In the colors of ending days. Lillian closed the folder. She said we'd meet again Saturday. Same time. Same place. She'd walk me through the office layout. The key players in each facility. The informal power structures that organizational charts never showed. She said to bring questions. Concerns. Fears. Anything that needed addressing before Tuesday morning. Before 8 o'clock. Before I walked through doors I couldn't walk back through. Not without consequences. Not without everyone knowing I'd quit. She stood. I stood. The meeting was ending. But the weight remained. The folder. The photos. The data. The evidence of everything wrong. Everything I'd agreed to fix. Everything I had no idea how to fix. Lillian walked me to the door. Said one more thing. Said the most important thing. Said I should remember why I'd stopped on that roadside. Why I'd gotten my hands dirty. Ruined my dress. Chosen help over image. She said that choice was my qualification. My credential. My authority when corporate voices tried to drown me out. That moment. That decision. That willingness to stop when everyone else drove past. She said corporations forgot that moment existed. Forgot that people like me existed. People who fixed things because they needed fixing. Not because fixing generated revenue. Not because helping improved metrics. Because it was right. Because someone needed it. Because not stopping would mean being someone else. Someone smaller. Someone I couldn't live with. She said holding on to that would be hard. Corporate culture would press from all sides. Would offer easier paths. Would suggest compromise. Would reward me for softening. For accepting acceptable. For learning to drive past. She said I should resist. Should stay uncomfortable. Should remember that comfort was what had led here. To this erosion. To this damage. To employees treated like expenses. Communities treated like public relations opportunities. People treated like problems requiring solutions. The door opened. Cold air rushed in. The afternoon was dying. Shadows stretched across lawns. Across driveways. Across the distance between this house and my apartment. Between preparation and reality. Between Thursday and Tuesday. I thanked her. Meant it. Felt the inadequacy of the words. But said them anyway. Because gratitude mattered. Because acknowledgement mattered. Because Lillian had chosen me. Had trusted me. Had handed me her life's work and asked me to protect it. She said don't thank me yet. Said wait until after 6 months. After the resistance. After the failures. After I'd learned how hard change actually was. How slowly culture shifted. How many people preferred damage to disruption. She said then if I still felt grateful I could say so. Could mean it fully. Could understand what I was thanking her for. Not opportunity. Not salary. Not position. But the chance to matter. To make work that had meaning beyond paychecks. Beyond survival. Beyond just getting through another day. I walked to my car. The Honda waited. Patient. Reliable. Unchanged by everything that had changed around it. I sat inside. Closed the door. The folder rested on the passenger seat. Heavy with evidence. With responsibility. With the weight of other people's pain. The drive home was quiet. Traffic was light. Holiday week. People visiting family. taking time off, resting before the new year, before resolutions, before whatever came next. My apartment welcomed me with radiator heat, with familiar smells, with the comfort of a space that asked nothing, expected nothing, just existed, just sheltered, just let me sit at Robert's table and wonder what I'd agreed to. The folder opened easily. Photos stared up. Charles, Amanda, Marcus, faces I'd need to know, to navigate, to somehow win over or work around, to transform from obstacles into allies, or at least into people who wouldn't actively sabotage every initiative. The surveys told stories in numbers, in percentages, in decline measured precisely, documented thoroughly, evidence that couldn't be dismissed as opinion, as feeling, as one person's perception against another's. But numbers weren't people, weren't the worker who'd left because childcare costs exceeded salary, weren't the manager who'd burned out trying to meet impossible quotas, weren't the community center that had closed when funding disappeared. I'd need to find those people, those stories, those faces behind the data. That's what Lillian meant about documentation. About building cases that couldn't be reduced to sentiment. That forced recognition. That made ignoring damage impossible. Saturday would bring more preparation. More names. More warnings. More weight added to what already felt crushing. But necessary. Essential. The work before the work. The foundation that might hold. Might let me survive 6 months. Might let me matter. The folder closed. The afternoon became evening. The apartment darkened around me. I didn't turn on lights. Just sat. Just breathed. Just let the weight settle. Let the reality sink in. Tuesday was coming. Ready or not. Prepared or not. Qualified or not. Just 4 days. Then everything would begin. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Saturday morning arrived with snow. Not the decorative kind. The heavy wet kind that made driving dangerous. That kept sensible people home. I drove anyway. Lillian was expecting me. The folder needed finishing. Preparation couldn't wait for better weather. Her driveway had been plowed. Salt scattered. Someone had been up early, making sure the path was clear, making sure I could arrive safely. The attention to detail felt deliberate, felt like care. Lillian opened the door wearing jeans. Actual jeans. Faded, comfortable. The uniform of Saturday mornings. Of weekends. Of time that belonged to her instead of corporate calendars. She said the snow was heavy. Said I was brave to drive. Said coffee was hot and we had work to do. Her voice carried energy, purpose, the tone of someone who'd spent a lifetime turning obstacles into merely annoying weather. The living room looked different in daylight. Brighter. The books more colorful, more varied. I saw titles, authors, subjects that ranged from business strategy to poetry. From economics to gardening, a mind that refused simple categories. We sat, same chairs, same positions, but today felt different, less formal, more like collaboration, like partnership instead of instruction. Lillian spread papers across the coffee table. Floor plans, building layouts, the company's 3 facilities, manufacturing in Bridgeport, distribution in Stamford, corporate offices in Greenwich, 3 different worlds under one corporate umbrella. She pointed to Bridgeport, said this was where I'd spend most of my time, where the real work happened, where products got made, where employees worked 12-hour shifts, where management rarely visited except for quarterly reviews. She said manufacturing was where culture lived or died. where policies became reality, where corporate decisions translated into human consequences. Faster quotas meant skipped breaks. Efficiency gains meant understaffing. Cost savings meant broken equipment running past safe limits. She showed me the break room. Small square on the blueprint. She said it used to have decent coffee, comfortable chairs, a bulletin board for family photos, for community announcements, for the daily texture of shared lives. Now it had vending machines, plastic chairs, nothing on the walls. Corporate had decided personalization was unprofessional, had removed anything that suggested workers were people, were families, were humans who existed beyond their productivity. She showed me the production floor, the assembly lines, the stations where workers stood, sat, repeated motions 800 times per shift, thousands of times per week, millions of times per year until bodies broke, until hands went numb, until backs couldn't straighten anymore. She said turnover was highest here, 40% annually. People left for lower pay elsewhere, for jobs that didn't destroy bodies, that didn't measure humans in units per hour, in defects per thousand, in metrics that forgot flesh had limits. She showed me the manager's office. Corner position, windows, climate control. The distance between that office and the production floor was more than spatial, was more than organizational, was the distance between comfort and consequence, between deciding and enduring. She said the current manager was David Chen. 20 years with the company. Good man once. Decent. But pressure had changed him. Had forced choices between meeting quotas and protecting workers. He'd chosen quotas. Had to. Had family. Had mortgage. Had no real choice at all. She said I'd need to reach him. To remind him who he'd been. What he'd valued. What he'd lost in the compromise between conscience and keeping his job. That wouldn't be easy. Maybe wouldn't be possible. But trying mattered. Next was Stamford. Distribution center. Warehouses. Loading docks. The place where products moved. Where trucks arrived. Departed. Where workers lifted. Loaded. Stacked. Sorted. Moved inventory until shoulders gave out. Until knees failed. Until bodies said enough. She said warehouse work paid minimum. Offered no benefits for part-timers. And most workers were part-time. Deliberately. Intentionally. Kept below the hours threshold that would require health care. Would require sick leave. Would require recognizing them as humans instead of flexible labor. She showed me injury reports. Pages of them. Back strains. Torn rotators. Carpal tunnel. Injuries that happened because quotas demanded speed. Because equipment was old. Because profit margins mattered more than safety margins. She said workers' comp covered medical costs. Barely. But didn't cover lost wages. Didn't cover families struggling when paychecks stopped. Didn't cover the fear of being replaced. Of becoming disposable. Of learning your body was less valuable than the boxes it moved. The Greenwich offices came last. Executive suites. Conference rooms. The place where decisions were made. Where policies were written. Where numbers on spreadsheets determined lives in Bridgeport. In Stamford. In homes across Connecticut. She showed me where my office would be. 3rd floor. Corner space. Windows overlooking a courtyard. Nice view. Good light. The kind of office that signaled status. That suggested importance. That separated me from the workers I was supposed to serve. She said this was deliberate. Was a test. Was management's way of co-opting. Of making me comfortable. of turning me from advocate into administrator. From someone who cared into someone who managed caring. She said I should spend minimal time there. Should work from facilities, from break rooms, from places where workers actually were. Where problems actually happened. Where solutions actually mattered. She said the office was a trap. Was comfort that would make me useless. Was the same trap that had caught Charles. That caught most executives. The trap of distance. Of reports instead of reality. Of data instead of faces. The papers covered the table now. Overlapping. A geography of damage. Of systematic erosion. Of choices that had seemed reasonable in boardrooms but were catastrophic in real lives. Lillian refilled coffee. Hers black. Mine with cream. Small detail. But she'd remembered. Had paid attention. Had seen me. The way she saw workers. The way she saw everyone. Not as categories. As individuals. She said Tuesday would be overwhelming. Said Marcus from HR would do orientation. Would explain policies. Procedures. The bureaucratic machinery designed to channel energy into approved processes. Into committees. Into studies that delayed action indefinitely. She said to listen politely. Take notes. Ask questions. Then ignore most of it. The real orientation would happen in facilities. Would come from workers willing to talk. To trust. To risk telling truth to someone new. Someone who might listen. Or might be just another corporate disappointment. She said building trust would take time. Weeks. Months. Workers had been disappointed before. Had been surveyed. Consulted. Asked for input. Then watched nothing change. Watched their words get filed. Forgotten. Used as evidence that management had listened even as nothing improved. She said I'd need to prove I was different. Not through words. Through action. Through small visible changes. Through following up. Through remembering names. Through showing up. Through doing what I said I'd do. Every time. Without fail. Without excuse. She said consistency was the only currency that bought trust. That everything else was just talk. Just performance. Just another management initiative that would fade when metrics didn't improve fast enough. The morning had become afternoon. Snow still fell, heavier now, accumulating. The world outside was white. Quiet. Suspended between the year ending and the new one starting. Lillian closed her folder. The last folder. The last preparation session. The last chance to change my mind. To walk away. To admit this was too much. Too big. Too impossible for someone like me. She asked if I was ready. Her voice was gentle. But the question was serious. Real. Not rhetorical. She'd accept no if I said it. Would understand. Would find someone else. Would not judge. Would simply know I'd been honest about my limits. I wasn't ready. Couldn't be ready. No amount of preparation could make me ready for what Tuesday would bring. For walking into that office. That world. That machinery of corporate power. But ready wasn't the requirement. Lillian had said so. Ready was a luxury. A myth. Something people pretended existed so they could delay. Could hesitate. Could wait for circumstances that never came. What mattered was willing. Was committed. Was refusing to quit when hard became harder. When resistance became active. When every day felt like failure. I said I was willing. Said I'd show up. Said I'd try. Said I couldn't promise success. Couldn't promise transformation. Could only promise effort, attention, consistency. The small reliable showing up that built trust. That proved I meant it. That demonstrated care wasn't performance. Lillian nodded, satisfied. or as satisfied as realistic people got. She said that was enough. Was more than enough. Was everything she'd hoped for when she'd watched me stop on that roadside. When she'd seen me choose help over convenience. Decency over appearance. She said I'd reminded her why she'd started. Why she'd fought banks. Why she'd worked 3 jobs. Why she'd built something, not for profit. Profit was byproduct. She'd built it for people. For workers who deserved dignity. For communities that deserved partnership. For the belief that business could build up instead of extract. She said I was betting on that belief. Was putting my time, my energy, my credibility behind the idea that corporations could care. Could change. Could remember their humanity. She said I'd probably lose. Probably fail. Probably discover that systems were too strong. Too entrenched. Too profitable to change. That was the likely outcome. The realistic expectation. But probably wasn't certainly. And failure wasn't permanent. And trying mattered even when succeeding didn't happen. Because someone had to try. Someone had to stop. Someone had to refuse to drive past. The snow had stopped. The afternoon was clear. Cold. The kind of cold that made breath visible. That turned exhaled life into temporary clouds. Into proof of presence. Of existence. Of still being here. I drove home carefully. Roads were slick. Treacherous. The kind of conditions that demanded attention. That punished distraction. That reminded drivers that safety required constant vigilance. My apartment was warm. The radiators had done their work. Heat filled every corner. Pushed back against the cold. Against the doubt. Against the overwhelming weight of what I'd agreed to carry. The folder sat on Robert's table. Closed now. Finished. Everything Lillian could teach me was taught. Everything she could prepare was prepared. The rest was Tuesday. Was showing up. Was walking through those doors and beginning. I made tea. Sat at the table. Let the steam rise. Let the warmth spread through my hands. Let the moment settle. The last moment before. The final pause before everything changed. Monday would be New Year's Eve. The world would celebrate. Would drink. Would count down. Would kiss at midnight. Would pretend fresh starts were possible. Were real. Were more than calendar transitions. But fresh starts were real. Sometimes. For some people. When they chose. When they stopped. When they said yes to impossible things. Tuesday morning. 8 o'clock. Whitmore and Hale Holdings. Greenwich office. 3rd floor. Corner space with windows I wouldn't use. That was my fresh start. My impossible thing. My choice to stop driving past. The tea cooled. The afternoon dimmed. The apartment held me gently. One more day. Then the year would turn. Then Tuesday would come. Then everything would begin. Ready or not. Willing or not. Here or not. Just me. Just a promise. Just the determination to try. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Tuesday morning came too fast and too slow. January 2nd. The first workday of the new year. The day resolutions began. The day people pretended change was possible. Simple. Just a matter of deciding. I dressed in my best slacks. My newest sweater. Clothes that said professional without pretending corporate. Comfortable shoes. Not heels. I'd learned that lesson. Comfort mattered more than image when the day stretched long. The drive to Greenwich took 40 minutes. Traffic was light. Post-holiday quiet. The world easing back into routine. Into obligation. Into the structures that held lives together or held them back. The Whitmore building stood glass and steel. Modern. Expensive. The kind of architecture that announced success. That said we've made it. That made visitors feel small before they walked through doors. I parked in the visitors section. Didn't have an assigned spot yet. Didn't have a key card. Didn't have any of the access that marked belonging. That separated employees from outsiders. The lobby was marble and minimalism. A reception desk. Chrome. Glass. A young woman behind it wearing headset and professional smile. The smile that welcomed and evaluated simultaneously. I gave my name. Said I was expected. Said Marcus Webb from our. The receptionist's fingers moved across a keyboard. Clicks and pauses. Verification. Confirmation. Permission granted. She directed me to the third floor. Said Marcus would meet me. Said elevators were to the left. Said have a nice day. The words were automatic. Practiced. Meaningless in the way corporate pleasantries always were. The elevator was empty. Quiet. The ascent was smooth. No sensation of movement. Just floor numbers changing. Just progression without feeling. Just arrival without journey. Third floor opened onto carpet. Beige. Institutional. The kind that hid stains. That lasted decades. That prioritized durability over beauty. Over personality. Over any suggestion that humans worked here. Marcus appeared immediately, like he'd been waiting, watching the elevator, timing his arrival to the second. He was younger than his photo suggested. Early 30s, sharp suit, sharper smile, the smile of someone trained in employee relations, in managing humans like inventory. He welcomed me, said congratulations, said this was exciting. His voice was warm, professional, empty as the elevator, empty as the carpet, empty as every corporate welcome ever delivered. He led me down hallways, past offices, past cubicles, past people working, typing, talking quietly, the low hum of productivity, of people earning paychecks, earning insurance, earning the right to keep earning. My office was exactly as Lillian had described. Corner position, windows, good light, a desk, a chair, a computer, a phone, everything necessary, nothing personal, a space waiting to be claimed or ignored. Marcus said this would be my base. Said I could personalize it. Said HR had guidelines. A handbook. Rules about what could be displayed. What couldn't. What was professional versus inappropriate. The careful boundaries between human and corporate. He handed me a folder. Thick. The kind that signaled importance. Or bureaucracy. Usually both. He said this was orientation material. Company history. Organizational structure. Policies. Procedures. The handbook that governed everything. That made rule following feel like common sense. He walked me through it. Page by page. Benefits. Time off. Expense reports. Dress code. Email policies. Social media guidelines. The accumulated wisdom of corporate attorneys. Of HR professionals. Of people paid to limit liability. To protect the company from its employees. He explained my reporting structure. Direct line to Lillian, but dotted line to Charles. Meaning I answered to her. But couldn't ignore him. Couldn't operate without his awareness. His implicit approval. His ability to make my work easy or impossible. He explained the review process. 6-month evaluation. Based on measurable outcomes. On documented impact. On metrics that could be quantified. Defended. Justified to boards. To shareholders. To people who measured success in numbers. He asked if I had questions. His tone suggested there shouldn't be. That everything was clear. That only confused people needed clarification. And confusion wasn't professional, wasn't the impression anyone wanted to make on their first day. I asked about facility access, about visiting Bridgeport, Stamford, about talking to workers, about the actual work Lillian had described, the work Marcus hadn't mentioned, the work his handbook didn't address. Marcus paused, brief, almost invisible, but there, a hesitation, a calculation, a decision about how to respond, how to guide, how to contain. He said facility visits required coordination, required scheduling with managers, required advance notice, required following protocols, safety reasons, insurance reasons, liability reasons, the corporate machinery that made spontaneity impossible. That turned simple actions into complicated procedures. He said workers had jobs to do, had quotas to meet, had supervisors who managed their time. That unscheduled visits could disrupt productivity, could create problems, could raise questions about why corporate was suddenly interested, suddenly visiting, suddenly caring. I said caring was the job, was literally what Lillian had hired me to do, to rebuild relationships, to listen, to understand, to document what needed fixing. That required talking to people, being present, being accessible, not scheduling appointments through management filters. Marcus's smile held, but something behind it shifted, tightened. He said of course, said he understood, said he was just explaining standard procedures, guidelines that kept everyone safe, that protected everyone, workers included. He said I'd learn the rhythms, the appropriate ways, the methods that worked, that got results without creating friction, without making people uncomfortable, without disrupting the careful balance between care and efficiency. The word balance felt like surrender, like compromise, like the middle ground where good intentions went to die, where caring became managed caring, where humanity became policy-compliant humanity. The morning had become afternoon. Orientation had taken hours. Marcus finally stood, said welcome again, said someone from IT would set up my computer, said someone from facilities would bring supplies, said everyone was excited to work with me. The lie was delivered smoothly, professionally, with perfect corporate sincerity. He left. The door closed. The office was silent. Just me. Just the desk. Just the window overlooking a courtyard where no one went. Where grass grew without purpose. Where beauty existed only to be viewed from offices like this one. I sat in the chair. Leather. Comfortable. Designed for long hours. For people who spent careers in rooms like these. Making decisions. Writing policies. Forgetting what work actually meant. What workers actually needed. What caring actually required. The handbook sat on the desk. Unopened. Unread. A roadmap to corporate compliance. To avoiding trouble. To being effective within carefully defined boundaries. To caring just enough. Just appropriately. Just professionally. Lillian had warned me. Had said this would happen. Had said the office was a trap. Had said comfort would make me useless. Had said distance was death. The death of mission. The death of meaning. The death of everything she'd hired me to protect. I stood. Left the office. Walked down the hallway. Past cubicles. Past people who glanced up briefly. Who registered the new face. Who returned to work. To screens. To tasks that filled days. That justified paychecks. That kept the machinery running. The elevator descended. The lobby appeared. Marble and chrome and the receptionist's professional smile. She asked if I needed anything. Her tone was pleasant, detached, the tone of someone who saw hundreds of faces daily, who remembered none of them. I walked outside. The cold was sharp, clean, real in a way the office air hadn't been. Real in a way corporate sincerity never was. Real like roadside ice, like battery terminals, like grease stains that never washed out. My car waited, patient, unchanged. I sat inside, started the engine, let heat build, let the window defog, let the moment settle. The first day, the first trap, the first test of whether I'd keep my promise or break it with procedural compliance. I drove to Bridgeport. No appointment, no coordination, no advance notice. Just 40 minutes on Interstate 95. Just the manufacturing facility. Just the place where work actually happened. Where products got made. Where workers spent their days. Where truth lived undiluted by corporate filtration. The facility was gray concrete. Industrial. Practical. No architectural ambition. Just function. Just walls and roof. Just protection from weather while work happened inside. I parked in the visitors section. Walked to the entrance. A guard sat behind plexiglass. He asked for ID. Asked who I was visiting. Asked if I had an appointment. His tone was bored, professional, the tone of someone who asked the same questions 100 times daily. I said I worked for the company. Said I was new. Said I wanted to see the facility. To meet people. To understand the work. The guard looked uncertain. Picked up a phone. Called someone. Waited. Spoke quietly. Hung up. He said someone was coming. Said to wait here. Said the manager would need to approve. Would need to escort. Would need to verify I was who I said. That I was authorized. That I belonged. Minutes passed. 5, 10, 15. The lobby was cold. Bare. Just chairs and walls. Just space where workers paused before entering. Before leaving. Before spending 8, 10, 12 hours making products. Making quotas. Making profit for people who never visited. Never saw. Never remembered their names. The door opened. A man appeared. Asian. 50s. Tired eyes. David Chen. The manager Lillian had mentioned. The good man who'd been pressured. Who'd compromised. Who'd chosen keeping his job over protecting his workers. He said I should have called ahead. Should have scheduled. Should have followed procedures. His voice carried frustration, stress, the weight of unexpected corporate attention, of sudden oversight, of being caught unprepared. I said I was sorry. Said I should have. Said I was learning. Said I just wanted to see. To understand. To begin. Could he show me the floor? The work. The people. Just briefly. Just today. Just a start. David looked at me. Really looked. Measuring. Evaluating. Deciding whether I was threat or ally. Whether I was oversight or support. Whether I was another corporate performance or something different. Something real. He said the shift was ending. Said workers were tired. Said maybe another day. When he could prepare. When he could arrange. When he could control the narrative. Manage the impression. Protect himself. Protect them. Protect the careful balance that kept everyone employed. Everyone compliant. Everyone surviving. I said I understood. Said tomorrow then. Said I'd call first. Said I'd follow procedures. Said thank you. Meant some of it. Regretted the rest. The compromise. The retreat. The first day already bending toward corporate comfort. Toward procedural safety. Toward the distance Lillian had warned about. The drive back to Greenwich took forever. Traffic was heavier. Rush hour. People heading home, heading to families, heading to lives beyond cubicles, beyond factories, beyond the 8, 10, 12 hours that paid for everything else. My apartment was dark, cold. The radiators hadn't kicked in yet. Heat came slowly, grudgingly, the way trust would come, the way change would come. Slowly, painfully, with setbacks, with compromises, with days like today. Days that felt like failure before they'd properly begun. I sat at Robert's table. In the cold, in the dark, in the quiet aftermath of promises made and immediately bent. Of determination that had lasted one day, one morning, one encounter with corporate procedures before bending, before compromising, before learning that caring had protocols, that helping required permission, that fixing meant filling out forms. Tomorrow I'd call David, would schedule, would follow procedures, would begin properly, professionally, appropriately. Tomorrow I'd be smarter, more careful, more strategic, more corporate, more like everyone else who'd started with good intentions, with real care, with genuine desire to help. Before learning that help required permission, that caring required compliance, that changing systems meant first joining them, first becoming them, first losing the very thing that made change possible. The radiators hissed. Heat began. The apartment warmed slowly. The cold retreated. The darkness remained. Not outside. Inside. Where promises bent. Where determination faced reality. Where day one ended with compromise. With retreat. With the first small surrender of many. Just me. Just the cold. Just the knowledge that this was harder than stopping on a roadside. Harder than fixing batteries. Harder than anything I'd imagined when I'd said yes in Lillian's library. Just the beginning. Just day one. Just the long difficult start of everything that came next.